I do remember when we were talking about designing Bianca, is that we wanted there to be a reveal of some sort, that we wanted her to seem villainous at the beginning and then have her kind of switch up midway through, that so she becomes an ally towards the end.
Hey guys, it's Miharu. As you are no doubt aware, I love Spyro 3. And one of my favorite characters, not just from this game, but from the Spyro series itself, is Bianca. Beautiful, sneaky, sassy. If you are or have ever been a furry, chances are you had a crush on her or find her attractive. Perhaps even more so in Reignited with her Lola Bunny-esque redesign. But what is it that makes her so interesting? Well, to me personally, Bianca is important because of a little thing called character development. I've discussed this numerous times before, but this is one of the first instances in any video game I can remember in which a villain went through a redemption arc. I know that's a pretty common thing in media nowadays, and it's often over the course of several games or episodes before the villain even has a chance to redeem themselves. But sometimes simplicity is all we need, and this is a great example of a reformation arc done well given limitations. That is, it was, until Reignited screwed it up. Before I go on, I'd like to address a counter-argument I see frequently brought up, which is that Bianca was never a villain in the first place. To which I say, well, that's obvious. Bianca was never truly evil, that's a given. However, it doesn't change the fact that she starts off on the side of villainy. The whole point was to fool the player into making her seem like one of the bad guys. Where Bianca really shines in Reignited is in her design and animations. Her expressions, how she waves her wand, holds her ear when she's scared, she's just so cute. Appearance-wise, she's a near-perfect recreation of her old self. In fact, I dare say she looks even better. Then there's her voice. Melissa Hutchison does an excellent job at making her sound just as cute as she looks. I wish I didn't have to say it, but this is all part of what ultimately ends up being the downfall of her character and arc. First of all, there's no subtlety. Everything about her radiates this clumsy apprentice energy, from her comically oversized sleeves to the underlying timidity whenever she speaks.
Try looking after this. Try looking after this.
Notice how much more assertive her tone is in the original. That sass and confidence, even if it wasn't real, was enough to give the impression that she could have been a threat. Without it, much of her intimidation was lost. And speaking of intimidating, did you know she was given claws in Reignited? It's one of my favorite details about her design. But now all I can think about is the wasted potential behind this decision. If the sleeves on her robe weren't so long, those claws would have been visible, which could have been utilized to make her appear more menacing at the start of the game. Instead, Reignited chose to play up her innocent nature, reducing the overall quality of her story. Let's compare some cutscenes to help explain what I mean. When Bianca reports back to the Sorceress and tells her the eggs have been captured, the Sorceress makes a remark.
Maybe you will amount to something after all.
And in Reignited, we clearly see Bianca taken aback by these words. Now obviously I know it's going to be somewhat unfair to compare based on animations, as the remake is trying to show more expressiveness and emotion through action, which I like. But keep in mind, I'm comparing based on what I feel is lost due to these changes. This small, seemingly insignificant addition is displaying her uncertainty towards the Sorceress too early. This is further shown in the second warning. Look at the way she steps out from behind the tree. In the original, she has this squinty-eyed, smug look on her face, whereas in Reignited, she just does this. Again, this is what adds to her cuteness and charm. But that's precisely the problem, and this just makes it look like she's trying too hard to be a
scary sorceress,
rather than giving off that vibe naturally, which serves as a means for the player to question her motives and if she's truly evil or not.
And I believe part of the reason for making her the bunny was so when the hood came down, there was a change in her silhouette.
In the original version of the first scene with her and Hunter after he's captured, she walks up to the cage and lowers her hood before apologizing and offering him food. Now remember, this is the first time in the game we see her like this. It was the turning point of her character, and the act itself was symbolic of her showing her vulnerability and becoming more comfortable with revealing her true self. So by having her appear in Reignited with her hood already off, that symbolism is no longer present. But that's not the only detail I wanted to point out in this scene. Take a look at how Bianca responds when Hunter is trying to persuade her to let him go.
I'm sorry. I can't. I'm sorry. I can't.
In Reignited, she stops and thinks about it before telling him she can't. In the original, she looks back behind her, as if she's being watched. You can see she's having doubts, but this represents the hold the Sorceress has over her, like she's being constantly monitored and must keep up the act she's always known. It's very possible that Bianca saw the Sorceress as not only her mentor, but a parental figure as well. She trusted her and genuinely believed what they were doing was for the greater good of the Forgotten Realms, further explaining her attitude towards Spyro. So when the Sorceress's ultimate plan of gaining immortality by killing the baby dragons is revealed, it's supposed to come off as though she's legitimately been deceived.
Wait a second. A spell?
Listen to the stuttering, the utter shock and confusion in her voice as she learns the truth, like everything she thought she knew is suddenly crumbling before her.
Wait a second. A spell?
Needless to say, she doesn't sound as perturbed in Reignited. Voice performance is something I'm always paying attention to and critiquing, and I have quite a bit to say about it in Bianca's case. As I said earlier, I like Melissa's performance as a whole, and think her voice fits the character very well. Her portrayal comes off as more sarcastic and playful in the opening bits of Sunrise Spring, giving the impression that she's a lovable dork who's trying her best to be evil. A fine decision on paper, and one I might normally enjoy, but in comparison to the original, it's something I greatly take issue with. Now, I'm not saying she had a ton of depth by any means, but Pamela Hayden's portrayal of Bianca during these beginning parts comes off as more condescending and unlikable, better setting up player motivation to prove her wrong, and thus making her turnaround all the more effective. Of course, due to the graphical limitations of the PS1, that meant voice acting was key. It was essential in making sure the proper emotion was expressed to the audience, and it was pulled off brilliantly with each line of dialogue. Each time you encounter Bianca in-game, you can tell something within her is changing, until finally she greets you in Midnight Mountain, and later the Super Bonus round, having come full circle from how she was before. But there was one instance in particular, the line that sparked the idea for this video, something that, in my opinion, was the undoing of Bianca's character arc in Reignited. I am of course speaking of the first encounter in Evening Lake. Here's the dialogue from the original.
Listen to me, Dragon. Spyro, this is serious now.
And here it is in the remake.
Listen to me, Dragon. Spyro, this is serious now.
Once again.
Listen to me, Dragon. Spyro.
That pause, that was intentional. I must stress the importance of this line delivery because, just like the scene with her and Hunter, this was a major turning point for her. She had to bring herself to say Spyro's name, admit to herself that she really did care about him and Hunter and didn't want to see them get hurt. There is so much emotion in this line alone that perfectly conveys the inner struggle she's experiencing, and Reignited just throws that out the window by making it seem like nothing more than a drive-by occurrence, completely diminishing whatever impact it had. This is so disappointing because it comes across as if her change of heart happened instantaneously, or rather that it was unnecessary, like everything she had said and done up until that point had been meaningless. The fact is, though we like to brush this off as a simple case of a villain turning good, it's more about a misguided character finding the courage within themselves to forge their own path and do the right thing, even if they were afraid to do so. Interestingly enough, this is actually reflected quite well through Bianca's new idle animations. In Sunrise Spring and Midday Gardens, she's
very angry.
In Evening Lake and Midnight Mountain, there's a hint of sadness and concern. And in the Super Bonus round, after the Sorceress has been defeated, she's noticeably happier. She's still happy before the second fight as well, but that's beside the point. It's crazy how, even now, Bianca manages to fascinate me with how well written she is as a character. Her story is so straightforward yet so compelling for a game such as this. And that's my main problem with her in Reignited. She just isn't properly characterized. The transition from old to new wasn't handled as well as it could have been, resulting in her feeling like the same character from beginning to end. So does all of this mean I hate her in the remake? No, not at all. But for such an important character in the series, the only antagonist turned protagonist in the original trilogy, it's just sad to see her story scaled down like this. When it comes to Elora comparisons, most people are likely to bring up her delivery on the famous line,
I'm a fawn, you dork.
They'll say how she sounded meaner in the original and more playful in Reignited.
I'm a fawn, you dork.
And they're not wrong per se. However, was that always the intention? Was that line supposed to sound harsh in the original? I'm not so sure. She certainly sounds a bit annoyed, what with the more emphatic tone on the word
Dork.
which in itself is kind of a soft word to be using if you're truly upset, but I always saw Elora as a kind-hearted character, so it wouldn't make sense for her to suddenly snap at Spyro. Honestly, I think he's to blame here. That question was kinda rude. This is definitely a case of the graphical limitations being a hindrance, because it's entirely possible they didn't mean for it to come off that way in the first place. It would be easy to say that the problem with Elora in Reignited is that she's too nice and affectionate towards Spyro, and the last part is true. I mean, they really played up her crush on him with those tail-wagging animations. But is that really the issue here? How she acts towards Spyro? Let's leave that be for a moment and shift focus to how she acts due to the presence of another character, Ripto. Listen to each of these lines back to back.
Yeah, how about 22475? That's my birthday.
No, Hunter, don't!
What?
How about 22475? That's my birthday.
No, Hunter, don't!
Say hello to your new king.
Professor, shut it down! Hurry! Professor, shut it down! Hurry!
Go through the portal, you idiot!
Tell all your friends to take the orbs and scatter them throughout Avalar, quickly! Tell all your friends to take the orbs and scatter them throughout Avalar, quickly!
Now, I will admit the musical changes were a contributing factor in making the impact feel different, but just going by vocal performance alone, there's obvious fear in her voice in the original. Don't ask how she knew it was going to come through that portal, but she could sense Avalar was in danger, and that really comes across in her delivery. And then there's the fact that, at the end of the scene in Reignited, they cut out her saying that they better go to Glimmer right now,
How about Glimmer?
Good idea. We better go right now.
replacing it with this rather awkward moment of the characters smiling at each other in silence. Maybe I'm looking too deep into this, but I found that line to be somewhat important because it gave a more clear impression that the safety of Avalar was Elora's #1 concern, and that they needed to catch a dragon as soon as possible to get rid of Ripto. But now that I think about it, it does make some sense why they removed it, seeing as she stated at the beginning of the scene that this had happened a week ago, thus making the right now part a bit confusing. Even in her first line of the game you can hear a major difference. The original sounds so impatient, but again, it isn't meant to come off as irritable, but rather distressed. You can tell she's very worried about the whole ordeal and just wants it to be over.
Is it working, Professor?
As for her in the remake, she wants the same thing of course, but has a different way of expressing it, and this line right here says it all.
Oh no!
She sees Ripto as a mere annoyance, nothing more, nothing less. And after Gulp's fight when she thinks he's gone, listen to that relief and compare it with this.
Spyro, you did it! Spyro, you did it!
It's too watered down, as if she's not fully emoting her satisfaction with all Spyro's done for them. Probably the only line of hers I have a problem with. If you're still confused, allow me to paint a better picture of the distinction between these two portrayals of the character. Elora in the original seems to prioritize the well-being of Avalar and its inhabitants, and is set on removing the threat by whatever means necessary, while Reignited Elora treats the situation as if it's just a worse day than usual. After all, we know for a fact that things were pretty bad even before Ripto showed up. But that's not to say she lost her caring nature completely. The new animations added the extra detail of her helping the professor up in this scene, and there's an air of respect in her tone when speaking to him, which I really like. In fact, her clothing could even be seen as symbolic, the leaf dress possibly representing her gentle demeanor and how in touch she is with the world around her. To put it simply, it all comes down to a serious versus carefree personality, and both are fine. Elora didn't have a character arc. She was the same from start to finish, with no strict guidelines that needed to be followed. To me personally, it isn't a case of right and wrong. I prefer the reignited version of Hunter. Now, before you point your torches and pitchforks at me for making such an insanely unthinkable statement, let me explain. Hunter was never a favorite of mine to begin with. I mean, I didn't dislike him, but he annoyed me greatly, way more so than Moneybags. Want this important item you need to stop the bad guy and save our world? Correction, my world? Well, too bad. Play this dumb minigame first, and then maybe I'll consider giving it to you. Seriously, who does that? Well, that's the one thing about him that didn't change, but there are other factors that I think make him a much more likable character in the remake. First things first, let's get his design out of the way. I really don't see why anyone hates it, at least he looks like the animal he's supposed to be. Yeah, he's got weird french fry fingers, but he's also got tear stripes, you know, the main facial trait of a cheetah. Then there's the fact that his bow and quiver are now a permanent part of his look. What's wrong with that? He's pictured with them in a lot of early artwork and renders. Wouldn't surprise me if that was always meant to be a mainstay, but had to be removed because of limitations, resulting in it making only one appearance in Fracture Hills. Whenever I hear anyone discuss their distaste for Reignited Hunter, they more often than not bring up his voice. Greg Berger's role as Hunter in the originals is iconic, what with that slow way of speaking and oddly placed emphasis on certain words.
Hey, you nailed all of the targets.
His performance established the character as what some might call a stoner. Robbie Daymond, on the other hand, gives him more of a 90s skater/surfer dude vibe, with a faster, cooler style of speech, which has been compared to Sonic the Hedgehog.
Hey, Spyro. I found this gladiator training arena that also makes for a pretty cool skate park.
Perhaps a tad generic by today's standards, but not bad in general. But in doing that, was the character completely changed? In the original, at least in Spyro 2, I always saw him as a cowardly lion type, someone who was clearly afraid but willing to help out a friend in need, or withholding a side. And by Spyro 3, most of that fear seems to have vanished, but he's more or less the same. There are a few changes made to the way Hunter expresses himself. He definitely seems goofier for sure, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing in his case. He's a lot less laid back and more athletic, as evident by his idle animations, and that's a fine fit for a cheetah. In fact, there are a couple details added to his first scenes that I think add an extra bit of flair to his attitude. When Spyro asks,
"You got a problem with that pussycat?"
we see him about to talk back before Ripto blasts them. He wasn't gonna take that sass. And then there's this.
Hey, I could do that. Why doesn't the dragon just torch Ripto?
He really doesn't want Spyro hogging all the glory. It would explain his constant need to play keep away with the orbs. Something I never quite understood is why he's the tutorial character. He doesn't know the first thing about dragons, and now suddenly he's an expert on how to glide? Then again, he did make that flying contraption for himself. Maybe this is all about jealousy? But I digress. To be honest, it's these in-game encounters that made him more likable in my opinion. Yes, it's still annoying to hear the same line of dialogue over and over every time you fail one of his stupid challenges, but I actually found it more tolerable. Again, his original voice and line delivery is so unique and recognizable, but I always felt that he was talking down to me as the player. Highly subjective, of course, but I didn't feel that way in Reignited. He felt more like my buddy as the game progressed. An idiot, sure, but a buddy nonetheless. To sum it up, he didn't make me want to punch him in the face nearly as often. Now you may be asking yourself, why did I have a problem with the softening in Bianca's character, but it's fine for Hunter? Well, that's because he's supposed to be your friend, your guide in this strange new world you've been thrown into without warning. Sure, Reignited puts a little spin on it by having him seem like a bit of a jerk at first, as mentioned earlier, but he quickly backs off once Elora throws some truth at his face.
Hunter, you can't even keep track of your running shoes. How can we trust you with 14 talismans?
It's almost as if he has to learn to work with you just as much as you with him. So what is the issue? Is it that he's too friendly? No, we just established he has a cocky side and displays it outright. Maybe his fear is too amplified? Well, he certainly is afraid, but at least he has the guts to actually try and stop Ripto from taking the power crystal. Some people would say that was part of the joke, him just sitting there telling him to give it back, but to be honest, the flashy animations fit better with his new energetic portrayal. Hunter's not the best when it comes to conflict, when it doesn't involve saving a pretty girl. I've heard some say he's too dumb, as if the original wasn't. And then I've heard that he's too much of a comic relief character. Call me crazy, but isn't that what he was always supposed to be? I guess you could make the argument that his humor was more relaxed in the original, while more pronounced in the remake, but that can be said for a majority of his quirks. Basically, what it all comes down to is that he's different. No, he's not the Hunter we grew up with, but while it seemed everyone else had been toned down in Reignited, he was actually toned up? I would even go so far as to say the exaggerations to his character in the remake give him more personality, or at least that it helps properly express all his emotions. So, you may disagree, but to me, this is who he should have been back in 1999. This is a character I would have really liked as a kid, and I think that's the most important thing to take away here. Hell, I would have liked everything about this remake as a kid, no questions asked. But to see Hunter specifically, whom I was never crazy about, finally portrayed in a way that makes my inner child happy, that's all I need to say. I prefer the new over the old. Let's go back to 2018 when we got our first look at the remade cover artwork of Spyro 3. Now, of course, the leak was blurry as hell and half of Sheila's face was chopped off, but oh my god, what is that? They gave her hair buns. No, it's a hat. She has aviator goggles. She's a milkmaid. Theories and speculations flying every which way. Of course, what we ended up getting was indeed hair, and as with Elora, there were those who liked it and those who hated it, but mostly the latter. The most common complaint relating to her hair was that it sexualized her, which is completely ridiculous. It's not like they gave her boobs, it's just hair. And while I do agree that maybe it's not the best style, I would have preferred just a singular high ponytail myself, it's not a bad design choice at all. There are many people who never even knew Sheila was a girl until now, so hey, this decision, along with her voice sounding less androgynous now, actually ended up being helpful. And before you say, how did anyone not know she was a girl? I mean, I thought Cinder was a guy when I first saw the trailer for A New Beginning.
Cinder's a chick?
We all make mistakes. But anyway, giving her hair did not change her personality or make her stereotypically feminine, it just gave her some much needed flair when the jacket might not have been enough. I don't know if you noticed, but Sheila in the original was the blandest of all the critters. She had no defining features or characteristics, she was just a simple kangaroo. And don't get me started on how her waist is too tiny. She's a cartoon character for crying out loud. They obviously gave her a small upper half for the purpose of exaggerating her large, powerful legs. It's really not that big of a deal. If I'm to comment on any issue I may have had with her character in Reignited, it would be her line delivery when she's talking to Spyro in her debut scene. This was a pretty serious conversation in the original. Spyro's learning that the dragons used to live in the Forgotten Worlds, that the magic is fading away and people are losing the ability to go back home. Then we have the Reignited version in which Sheila just looks and sounds a bit too chipper explaining all of this. I'm particularly bothered by this line here.
Yeah, they're starting to fade out too, one by one.
Just, why is she smiling? That doesn't sound like a good thing to me. It's changes like this that end up messing with the whole tone Year of the Dragon was trying to set, and it's very disappointing to me. Overall, I'm happy with how Sheila turned out, in terms of both design and gameplay.
A dragon? You brought a dragon to Avalar? I hate dragons! But I really like YouTube analysis videos, especially on Spyro. So hello and hi, Miharu the Fox. This is Greg Berger, and I'm sending a shout out and a hi and a little bit of Ripto to you, because I'm the voice of Ripto!
I'm gonna say this up front. If you were to ask me which version of Ripto I prefer, I'd have to go with Reignited overall. I do believe this is the definitive version of the character. However, there are certain things about the original that I find superior, which I'll get to later. First, let's start with the design. It was somewhat controversial when first revealed on the Reignited box art, from his big bobblehead, made more exaggerated by his tinier torso and longer, skinnier legs, to his curly-toed shoes. People also didn't like the fact that his once normal-looking green eyes were replaced with more reptilian ones with slits for pupils. Personally, that was my favorite change, along with his visible sharp teeth and claws. It's now more clear that he's supposed to be some sort of dinosaur, whereas before we didn't exactly know that until Enter the Dragonfly, in which we can plainly see all of his minions, given the name Riptox, are also that type of creature. One of the biggest criticisms any game will get is if they replace a character's voice. Luckily, in Reignited's case, some of the actors were able to reprise their roles, and Greg Berger as Ripto was one of them. As expected, he played the character very closely to how he did 20 years ago, albeit with a few changes to better match the updated design and animations. He's a lot more expressive, of course, and his voice had to reflect that. Interestingly enough, from what I remember hearing before the game's release, they wanted to go with a more sinister, low-voiced portrayal of Ripto. And I can definitely hear it in lines like this,
"You may have been able to defeat that simpleton,"
when compared to the original.
"You may have been able to defeat that simpleton."
Now, a different take on a character is by no means a bad thing. In this case, it was probably done to make him seem like a genuinely threatening villain despite his stature. However, I suppose it backfired, as what we got ended up sounding very gravelly and more generically angry than it did before. Obviously, I understand a person's voice can change over the course of many years, so that was a contributing factor. But I also believe direction played a part as well. In wanting to see this new menacing version of Ripto through, the charm in that loud, over-the-top rage he's known for was nearly lost. So, when it comes to vocal performance, I have to give it to the original. if not only for the delivery on these lines sounding much cooler and more intimidating.
I'll kill you! Dragon, you've just sealed your fate!
But moving on to his personality, was it impacted at all? Well, not so much on the surface, as he's still the same short-tempered, dragon-hating Ripto we're familiar with. Let's compare some cutscenes to see how any of Reignited's alterations may have affected his character. Starting with the intro and his exclamation of,
I hate dragons! Yeah!
In the original, he pauses between each word and flails his arms in frustration, really driving the point home. Whereas in Reignited,
I hate dragons! Yeah!
There are no pauses, and he charges up his scepter afterward. I've talked enough about my preference for the old delivery, but as for this new action, I like it. Don't get me wrong, the flailing is adorable, but charging his scepter implies that he's going to kill Spyro where he stands, ridding himself of the dragon problem. And it makes sense. If he hated them so much, and had a means of disposing one that stood before him, it's not so hard to believe he'd take that chance. Now let's look at his arrival in Avalar. First off, I love the added detail of him grabbing the professor as he sniffs for dragons. Clearly he's someone who does what he wants and has no regard for personal space. But there's something I love even more about this scene.
Say hello to your new king.
The finger guns, the wink, everything about this perfectly represents his egotistical attitude. It makes a lot more sense than him bowing. I mean, isn't he the type who should be forcing people to bow before him? He's obviously full of himself, so that courteous act wouldn't fool anyone anyway. But personal thoughts time, it's the little things he does that make me love him so much. From the way he sits with his legs crossed to his smug grin when swiping away the power crystal, it's these extra touches that really capture the appeal of his personality. It's pretty much exactly how I perceived him as a kid. It didn't matter to me whether he was supposed to come off as a serious villain or not. In fact, I made fun of just how lazy he is in an older video. I'm just glad they made him just as cute and likable as I thought he was back in the day. The Sorceress is a character I didn't really plan on discussing, but after giving it some thought, I realized there are some things I can talk about regarding her change in character. Like with Ripto, the Sorceress's new design was first revealed on the Reignited box art, and people had opinions. Nothing necessarily positive or negative from what I remember, just opinions. I personally think her in-game model looks fine. She's a bit slimmer and taller, and her facial features are more exaggerated, but it's really not a bad update at all. And I appreciate the approach they went with in making her look more alligator-like. But that's not the main point I wanted to go over. When it comes to the Sorceress, what really seemed to divide the fans was her voice, and by extension, personality. When you think about it, she really is the coldest, darkest villain in the trilogy. Her story wasn't about revenge or wanting to take over the world. She craved immortality by feeding off magic, and was willing to murder newborns in order to achieve that goal. As such, her voice in the original, provided by Flo DeRay, very much reflected those desires. It was intimidating, scary. You could feel every word she spoke dripping with malice and hate, perfectly complementing her cruel nature.
You bumbling, idiotic, worthless fool! I ask you to carry out one simple task, and you fail me! I should have known better than to rely on a child. But don't worry about it. I'll deal with them now.
And then you have Misty Lee's portrayal of the character in Reignited.
Without the dragons, the magic in this world will wither away. Without magic, I'll die. And so will your ever slim chance of becoming a sorceress.
Now, what are your feelings when you see this clip? You probably think it's goofy, over the top, that this sorceress is nothing more than a bossy diva, and this looks more like a mother scolding her child. But is it possible that this alteration could end up being just as scary? Think about her role in this game. She's the main villain, yes, but she was also Bianca's mentor, and for all we know, could have raised her since she was very young. The fact is, Bianca had been influenced by this woman's teachings for who knows how long. Now ask yourself, if you were in her shoes, which one would you put your trust in first? Which one do you think could have more easily fooled someone into thinking their intentions were good, allowing them control over their actions? So no, perhaps she doesn't sound as frightening or full of spite in Reignited, But that's not the reason why she should be feared. Instead of coming off as a clearly evil witch right away, she deceives by keeping up a regal act, smiling and clapping like she's proud of her student, but her voice being just powerful enough to show that she's abusing her position as both a sorceress and a maternal figure. And while it's true that maybe she should have slowly slipped back into her raspy, hate-filled tones throughout the course of the game as she reveals her true self, the decision not to do so, I think, ended up being much more effective, as it represents a very real issue in the world today.
Hey Spyro fans, it's Tom Kenny, the voice of Spyro the Dragon. Come on, Sparks, we're gonna go to Dragon Shores. And you're already a Spyro fan because you are hanging out with Miharu the Fox on YouTube. Hey, Miharu, thanks for keeping Spyro alive.
Hey guys, it's Miharu. For all the time I've put into discussing and analyzing the other characters in the Spyro series, I realize I've neglected to talk much about Spyro himself. And the reason for that is honestly quite a simple one. You see, Spyro doesn't really play that significant of a role in terms of story. Aside from maybe the first game, which hints at some sort of destiny, so little of each game's plot actually revolves around him. I've described him in the past as being a bystander, a blank slate for the player to put themselves in the position of. And while that's understandable, as the main focus was always on gameplay, I sometimes feel that he's treated as an afterthought. But that's not to say he has nothing going for him. Spyro is, after all, a video game mascot from the late 90s and a dragon. So what's the one aspect Insomniac could have emphasized to make him more appealing to kids at the time? A little bit of edge.
Dragons can fly, they can run, they can flame, they can jump, they can do anything, and they're cool.
Yes, it was his personality that truly made him a memorable character. He may be small and cute, but he's also courageous and possesses a genuine sense of adventure. The very definition of big things come in small packages. And then the Reignited trilogy came along, and at first, it seemed like we'd gotten everything we'd ever wanted. Spyro looked amazing, Tom Kenny was reprising his role. It was pure nostalgia. Our boy was back. How could they possibly screw him up?
The model, I love. I love their model. People will be mad to hear this. I like him better than our original Spyro.
Before I discuss what fell short, I like to start with positives. And if that wasn't proof enough that Toys for Bob absolutely nailed the design, I don't know what is. It underwent some changes, of course, but overall remained similar. The most notable difference is the color scheme.
The only one that really bugs me is Spyro's the wrong color.
And his horns now have the ability to move slightly in order to display a range of emotions. However, what really brings Spyro to life is his playful body language, which is highly accentuated and reignited. Toys for Bob collaborated closely with Insomniac to ensure that Spyro's nuances and expressions were captured accurately. According to a statement in the art book by Josh Nadelberg, he's like a puppy who feels like he can go out and do what the big dogs do. And this sentiment is reflected well in his animations.
What's great is that you guys really understand who Spyro is. I mean, I think that's at the core what matters. And as a result, the animators can bring his personality, make it even more obvious.
I have no doubt the team spent countless hours observing reference footage in order to ensure his personality stayed faithful, but here's the question: which part of it did they make obvious?
Hey Miharu, this is Carlos Alazraki. I just wanted to say, watch out for Nasty Nork, and all the Spyros are cool. Alright, take care.
Voice acting, my favorite thing to critique. Before we begin, it is worth noting that over 5 different actors, such as Jess Harnell in A Hero's Tale and Elijah Wood in the Legend series, have taken on the role of Spyro throughout the years. However, for the sake of keeping things simple, I'll be sticking to the original trilogy and the reignited version. When discussing the voice acting, we need to consider that there are 2 separate comparisons to be made. The first is Carlos Alazraki versus Tom Kenny, both from 1998 to 99, and from 98 to 2018.
He was like really young and had Lionel up in the nose, and then he was like really cooler and older. Then we just kind of did a mixture in between the two, where it's kind of like he's really kind of a go-getter kind of guy and kind of tough. but really kind of nice.
When you think of Spyro's voice in the first game, what words come to mind? Okay, I suppose that's to be expected. Get out of here with that. We are past the days of dunking on Carlos's performance. And what do you mean, unfitting? It was the first interpretation, so it was exactly what it needed to be. It captured the mischievous and playful nature of the character perfectly. The nasally tone added a unique charm, and it's just as important to acknowledge this portrayal and appreciate what Carlos brought to the role. As what happened with Ratchet from the Ratchet & Clank series, Spyro was initially portrayed as a lot more snarky than he would be in the sequels. But that's not to say he didn't still retain his fiery attitude after Tom took over. These commercials are proof enough of that.
Now that's my idea of fun. Happy holidays, fat boy. That's gotta hurt.
However, in Reignited, this would be cleaned up a bit in favor of a more sympathetic and softer take. Which brings me to our second comparison, Tom Kenny versus himself, 1999 to 2018. At San Diego Comic-Con's Reigniting a Legend panel, Tom Kenny provided insight into his interpretation of the character and his approach to delivering lines.
Spyro is all attitude, and I remember at the time thinking the hardest thing was you want to give him that brash confidence, where he's ready to rumble and he's adventurous, but you don't want him to be a jerk, you know what I mean? Like, that was the hardest thing was keeping him likable.
He clearly understands what Spyro is all about, and if there's one thing he gets absolutely perfect in this performance, it's his enthusiasm. But in not wanting some of these deliveries to come across as too harsh, they end up not being as effective in the final product. His portrayal of Spyro in this remake makes him appear more amiable and friendly when interacting with certain characters.
I was born to glide.
Who are you again?
I'm out of here. How about charge them and flame them? We are dragons after all.
Even his very first line emphasizes his spunk over his determination.
Looks like I've got some things to do.
Interestingly, both Insomniac and Toys for Bob shared concerns about him potentially being perceived as too mean-spirited.
That he was like really cooler and older, and they actually recorded something like that, but then they found out he was too mean.
As previously mentioned, the repercussions of a character's personality being handled this way were very evident in Ratchet's case. And it was these worries that prompted Toys for Bob to make the decisions that ultimately altered Spyro's characterization. To be fair, there was an attempt to bring him back to Carlos's interpretation when Jess took over for A Hero's Tale. But with an 18-year gap between Year of the Dragon and Reignited, Toys for Bob was faced with the same challenge all over again of finding the balance between naughty and nice, a task that required careful consideration and skillful execution to ensure that the character resonated with both old and new fans alike. Despite his very minimal inclusion in the storytelling though, there might be more to our titular hero than we give him credit for. So, whereas you may have heard a scratchy, childish, go-getter voice in the first game, taking the time to actually listen to what he's saying and how he says it reveals aspects of his personality one might not be aware of. Let's compare some cutscenes so you can hear for yourself the differences in the way the dialogue is delivered and how that ends up affecting Spyro's overall character.
Yeah, well, you could have found an easier spot to get stuck.
With treetops being one of the first levels shown off, this one stuck out to me immediately. Everyone knows the struggle of rescuing Jed. Players have gotten countless game overs trying to string these supercharges perfectly. So when you finally reach him, and maybe it's just me, but Spyro sounds pissed off. And rightfully so. Dude, I just wasted all my lives trying to get up here. But then, in Reignited...
Yeah, well, you could have found an easier spot to get stuck.
Coupled with that face, it sounds more like he's lecturing him. Like, nah man, I'm not mad, but I am gonna give you a light scolding. Sure, it's not Jed's fault, but this reaction just doesn't line up with the frustration we were feeling at that moment.
Any advice before this battle?
This is a really interesting example because it's the first instance we get of Spyro seeming genuinely nervous about something. Up until this point, it's been, what should I be afraid of? And bring 'em on! And
supercharge? excellent.
I mean, he doesn't even bat an eye at the enemies carrying guns later on, but for Jacques, he doesn't quite know what to think. And although it could be interpreted as him seeing the boss fight as a joke, with the air quotes around battle, I've always seen it as the former. The fact that he would even ask Revilo for advice at all is telling. Then in the remake, it's...
Any advice before this battle?
just a question. No pause, nothing to seem unsure about. He's just smiling and ready to go. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, what's he got to be afraid of? Which brings me to this comparison from all the way back in Artisans.
Afraid? Of what?
Falling from high mountain peaks? Plummeting into prehistoric glaciers?
Oh, that.
Look at his face when Tomas brings up the possibility of falling and crashing. He's nervous, which makes sense. But in the original...
Afraid? Of what?
Falling from high mountain peaks? Plummeting into prehistoric glaciers?
Oh, that.
Did you hear that? That little intrusive chuckle? This is what makes his later interaction with Revilo so notable. Because, as I mentioned earlier, Spyro in this game is a daredevil. He could care less about messing up a glide as long as he gets to toast Nasty Nork in the end. Now we'll look at some scenes from the sequels. Moving back into the direct comparisons between Tom Kenny's two performances, some people say they saw major improvement here in Reignited, particularly in the way Spyro interacts with Elora. They'll say Tom's original take made him sound too generic and aloof, that he lacked the personality Carlos gave him. But the way I see it, and what I think many people fail to realize, is that Spyro was thrown into the Avalar situation against his will. All he wanted was a vacation, some time to relax, and now he's being asked to help deal with a threat to a world he didn't even know existed. He's tired, and his voice reflects that. Just listen to the way he says this.
Okay, no problem. I'll collect a few talismans, give Ripto the old hot foot, and be in Dragon Shores by lunchtime.
Kinda gives the impression that he wants to get this over with ASAP, right? Not that he doesn't care, he just thinks he's earned a rest and is convincing himself that the job won't take long.
Okay, no problem. I'll collect a few talismans, give Ripto the old hot foot, and be in Dragon Shores by lunchtime.
Here, you can clearly see that he's a lot more understanding of the situation and is determined to help out. So when he talks about defeating Ripto here, that reassurance comes across as if it's directed at Elora rather than himself. But his actions speak as loudly as his words. Due to the restrictions of the PS1 models, he doesn't really emote when Elora kisses him at the end of Spyro 2. However, in Reignited, he visibly lights up in response to her gesture, only for him to later say this in the next game.
Another noble warrior falls victim to the plague of love. Just look away.
So what is the truth? And Toys for Bob even went a step beyond by incorporating this subtle detail of Spyro wrapping his wing around Elora as she joins him to watch the fireworks. Year of the Dragon is my favorite of the three games for its tone and atmosphere, but that mood is all but completely non-existent in the remake, and cutscenes like the following are partly the reason why. I already talked about the problems I have with Sheila herself in this scene, but the way Spyro acts is also worth noting. First, this line.
Is that why some of the portals don't work? Is that why some of the portals don't work?
Just like with Elora, one is directed at himself, the other at her. Then take a look at this. That zoom in, which is only present in this version, is a visual indication of Spyro trying to piece together what he just learned. It's details like these that, when removed, take away the air of mystery this game had. But Sheila isn't the only critter he reacts differently to.
Well, the rumors of our extinction were slightly exaggerated. We just wanted a little peace and quiet.
In the original, there's a hint of cynicism in his response to Sergeant Bird's assumption, like he's annoyed that anyone could even surmise that his species had died out.
Well, the rumors of our extinction were slightly exaggerated.
We just wanted a little peace and quiet.
In Reignited, he's not as defensive about it. That sarcasm replaced with a more sincere answer. I can definitely understand why one might think these line deliveries make Spyro appear somewhat disconnected to the world around him, but those small touches are what gave insight into how he viewed various situations and characters. Each version of Spyro that I've mentioned thus far brought something to the table. The very first one with his quirky charm and impish nature, the revision with his more laid-back tone and sarcastic remarks, and then Reignited, which amped up his enthusiastic side more than ever before. However, while the latter did present us with a fresh take on our beloved dragon, I can't help but feel that it missed the mark in terms of really enhancing his essence. True, the remake did attempt to capture the blend of sass and sincerity that made Spyro so endearing, but ended up doing so in a way where it feels lacking in authenticity. The witty remarks and snarky comebacks that were once effortlessly woven into Spyro's dialogue don't seem as natural this time around. Much like in Bianca's case, this was a matter of, if you change the inflection, it changes the meaning. Spyro the Dragon was definitely a product of its time, a reflection of carefree 90s spirit, something that's nearly impossible to recreate in the world we live in now. And as much as I appreciate Reignited for their depiction of him, there will always be a piece missing. But what do you think? Do you see these alterations as a sign of personal growth for the character? Or has the more optimistic outlook done more harm than good? And how do you think this could affect his portrayal going forward?